Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Podcast Daily. This is Bill Landis, and we're continuing our look at some of Ohio State's more interesting opponents for the 2023 season. And for a bigger picture look at where Notre Dame is, we are pleased to be joined by Pete Sampson. He covers the Fighting Irish for The Athletic, former colleague of mine over there, the best person covering Notre Dame, in my opinion. Pete, we appreciate you joining us. How you doing, man?
I'm good. Good. It's hard to believe for Notre Dame, at least, like we're less than 2 weeks away from the first practice. Like I don't get to do the media day junket for conference stuff like you do. But it's hard to believe how quickly the season is going to be here now.
Yeah, Notre Dame gets the old week zero treatment, right? Mm-hmm. Going over to Dublin for it's Navy they're playing over there, right?
Yeah. It's and hey, last time they played in Dublin, they ended up playing for the national championship. So I think that they're hoping for some good karma based on the past travel precedents.
Yeah, well, if they have a successful regular season with the slate that they have to play, I think they have a pretty good shot at getting to the playoff. I guess I want to, before we dive into some of the, I guess maybe like more like personnel stuff and changes that are happening at Notre Dame, I'm kind of just curious, Pete, about like the vibe around Marcus Freeman after his first year there. And obviously I think Ohio State fans are interested in that too, given he is a former Buckeye and likes to talk about Ohio State a lot in the media, or maybe he's asked about Ohio State a lot and then gives answers on it. But yeah, a little of both. So like 9-4, I think in a vacuum, it's like, hey, good debut season. 9-4 with a loss to Marshall and a loss to Stanford. It's like, how are people feeling coming off of 9-4 bowl game win, really good win over Clemson, but losses to Ohio State, USC, Marshall, and Stanford?
I think it was kind of exhausting for the fan base to sort of process the season because it was so volatile, and they had gotten used to the way Brian Kelly's programs had operated, where you literally won every game you were supposed to win and did not win any of the games you weren't. And for Freeman, I think, the Ohio State game, like Notre Dame clearly was the lesser team, but like I thought they strategically played really well, certainly through three quarters, and then kind of the dam broke. But I think coming out of that game, you felt like, all right, they sort of played up a little bit that night, and you were optimistic about it. And then just a total flat tire the next week against Marshall, then up against North Carolina and BYU. You feel like they sort of have some things figured out. And then I think the loss to Stanford was worse than the loss to Marshall, because there was like no excuse for, oh, you played Ohio State the week before, or you got back late, or missed a day of prep, or you were just sort of flat because you put so much into the trip to Columbus, which I think Marcus Freeman in particular put a ton into that. So at that point, you're thinking like, all right, can this guy do it? Did Notre Dame make a huge mistake? And then the way the season finished, I think losing at USC, they didn't play well. Caleb Williams played great. They were in it, but that just felt more like a game where you didn't play well. The other team had the Heisman Trophy winner. You have to play well to beat the Heisman Trophy winner. So I think it's like cliche to say the jury is still out, because I think people are still optimistic about Freeman overall. But there were definitely some warning signs last year of like, oh, okay, this is a first-time head coach, and he's got a lot to learn, which was part of the deal when you promoted him. So I don't think anyone came away thinking he was going to be like, just, okay, Brian, you're going to pick up where he left off, is 30 plus years experience, and he's got everything figured out. But I think it's why this season is so critical for him, because they're built to win this year, whereas last year they had questions all over the place starting at the head coach. This year feels like the roster and the head coach should be much more settled.
It's an interesting thing because, and I guess maybe Ryan Day is in a similar position, or was in a similar position, just like first-time head coach, inheriting this machine from someone else, and maybe like Ohio State's machine was working at a little bit better clip than Notre Dame's was, but like there was just so much entrenched there, right? Brian Kelly was there for so long, and did things a certain way for so long, that Marcus Freeman just sort of like picked it up and ran with it. But now he's got a new offensive coordinator, new special teams coordinator, had to find a new offensive line coach. He's got like a second-year defensive coordinator who was a new hire for him. I guess on one hand, you think to yourself like, well, he's a young head coach and that's a lot of transition to handle. But on the other hand, I would think maybe, well, he's got more of his guys in there now. It's not just a bunch of like Brian Kelly holdovers. I don't know. What's your feeling on that? Is that more of a benefit you think for Marcus?
I mean, that's an optimistic reading of the situation. And you can read it that way, where it's like a kind of a his guys. And I wrote a big story on The Athletic last year where I talked to 5 Power 5 head coaches whose first job was a Power 5 head coaching job. They didn't have time to sort of learn on the fly when no one was watching. And they all, to a man, were like, when you're our first time head coach, you hear about like the his guys thing and you're like, okay, is that really that important? And then you live it and you're like, oh, okay, there's a reason why everyone talks about this. And so I do think the staff is more cut from, they're more in sort of the image of Marcus Freeman. That doesn't mean it's a better staff. I do think it's going to be a more cohesive staff. And to me, like where that should show the most is you should not have the flat tire game against Marshall or Stanford. If you do, like, you are in big trouble. But if everyone is sort of pulled one direction here in a better way than they were last year, then I think that you should have a less volatile, more predictable season. Losing Tommy Rees to Alabama is significant. Like, if Nick Saban wants to hire you, whether your fan base thinks you were a good coach or not, Nick Saban is the ultimate arbiter on that. And then, losing special teams coach Brian Mason is, I think, a significant loss because they set a program record in block punts. They won games on block punts last year. And you're just not going to be able to replicate that. I don't think Brian Mason would have been able to replicate that if he had returned instead of going to the Indianapolis Colts. So the offensive coordinator hire of Jared Parker was pretty controversial at the time. Freeman took some bigger swings on Andy Ludwig or Colin Klein from Utah and Kansas State, missed on both. Sort of, I think you'd have to say he settled on the in-house hire. That doesn't mean it will be a bad hire, but Jared Parker is going to have a lot to prove this year. But you have Sam Hartman at quarterback. I think that he would probably make any offensive coordinator look pretty good.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about Sam. Is there another player in college football with like more pressure on it this year? It just seems like I feel like people are pretty high on Notre Dame. And a lot of that is like, well, they're just going to be way better at quarterback this year than they have been since, I don't know, Brady Quinn. So
yeah, I think I'd probably since like Clausen was good. The team was bad, but Clausen was good.
Yeah.
Deshaun Kaiser was a second round pick, but you can sort of look back and they're like, oh, you had Will Fuller and CJ Prosides and Josh Adams and Ronnie Stanley, Mike McGlinchey, Quentin Nelson on your offensive line. Maybe that had something to do with it. But I don't know if Sam Hartman is under a tremendous amount of pressure because really, if he just replicates the stuff that he was doing at Wake Forest, Notre Dame will be infinitely better at court. And I think that's why people, or at least I am, I feel like Notre Dame has a real puncher's chance to make the playoff this year. I think they have a chance to get Ohio State and get USC because they have a quarterback who can go out and win a game for you. They didn't have that last year. I mean, I think anyone who watched the Notre Dame Ohio State game, and I'm not comparing Buckner and Drew Pine to CJ Stroud by any stretch, but like Notre Dame was just managing the quarterback position. Yeah, like I remember there was a throw Stroud made, I think it was like a 3rd and 8, where he spun left. I think his back might have been to the line of scrimmage and was rolling left, and he put it right on the left sideline. I don't know if it was to Abuka or Harrison, but like, you're just like, holy crap. Like that's what a difference maker at quarterback looks like. And Notre Dame didn't have that. And now I think that they do. So that's, I think that Hartman really can just sort of pick up where he left off and not play with the weight of the world on his shoulders. And I think that the way he looked in the spring game, not to read too much into spring games, all qualifiers there, but he absolutely torched Notre Dame's defense and was able to distribute the ball all over the field. Just looks like a dude back there. And Notre Dame sort of hasn't had that presence at quarterback in quite a while. And like, Ian Book was a very, very good college quarterback and a 4th-round pick, but I don't think Notre Dame, short of the Clemson game in 2020, I don't think I would ever have said that Notre Dame won a game because of Ian Book's play. I think they can win a bunch of games because of Sam Hartman this year, and that you just haven't said that about Notre Dame quarterback in a while.
So he's incredibly productive over 5 years at Wake Forest, like all-time ACC touchdowns leader. Like, well, I guess what's the thought on him continuing to thrive outside of what was a fairly unique offensive system at Wake Forest? Like, I read some stuff about Sam Hartman where they say like his productivity was a byproduct of the system that he played in, but I see some other stuff that says like, hey, if you take him out of that and let him like run a more traditional pro style offense, maybe he's even better and more efficient than he was at Wake Forest. So I guess I'm assuming Notre Dame probably thinks the latter. What are the vibes around him, I guess, as he gets lifted out of that Wake Forest system and gets planted into this Notre Dame system, and what that can mean for him moving forward?
Well, talking to people, sources of the program, I don't think that there was like this immediate, he showed up here, boom, ready to go. That when spring practice started, there was like some reticence of like, okay, is this it? Like, do we need to do the slow mesh? Like, what's the story here? And then I think as spring went on, he got better and better and better. And then what I was told is they the Jersey scrimmage, which I think Marcus might have taken from Ohio State, but they just have the right to, like, if the offense wins, you get to pick you get to be the home jerseys for fall camp. The defense wins, same thing. And Hartman just was incredible in this closed doors stadium scrimmage, and then he backed it up in the spring game, and then Tyler Buckner left 48 hours later. So I think that Hartman really turned it on, and you started to see the way you phrased it of like, well, if you take him out of the system, like, then what could he be? Opposed to you take him out of his system and he's really missing the system. So that progress, I think, it's the most significant thing that happened at Notre Dame this offseason. Is by the midpoint and certainly by the end of spring practice, Hartman looked like a guy where you say, 113 touchdowns and 13,000 yards. That's really going to translate at Notre Dame. Whereas I think at the beginning of spring practice, you were a little bit uncertain of whether it was going to show
up. So like, who's he going to throw the ball to? Like, Michael Mayer's gone, and like I Notre Dame's offensive line could be maybe, if not the best in the country, certainly in that conversation what they have coming back. But I feel like I don't know much about their skill. It just seems like there's a lot of guys that people feel really good about, but there's not maybe a ton of production to back that up. So what's that look like?
Yeah, there's no star player there. I think Jaden Thomas will probably be their leading receiver, but he's not really a next level guy. I think he's going to be super productive. If there is a breakout star at receiver, it's a sophomore named Tobias Merriweather. Had one catch last season. It was for a touchdown. He had a concussion at the end of the year, basically missed the last 4.5 games. He's more your 6'4" high jumper. Like, I think he would look pretty good on Ohio State's depth chart, and I wouldn't say that really about anybody else on Notre Dame's roster. I'm not saying he would play a lot at Ohio State, but he's somebody that if he was wearing scarlet and gray, you'd be like, oh yeah, he fits in. That's the guy that really needs to move the needle for Notre Dame this year. They have some young talent. Jaden Greathouse was an early enrollee, 4-star prospect out of Texas. Had 11 catches in the spring game, which was, again, they're all from Sam Hartman. So you're kind of thinking like, all right, well, maybe there's something here. But they're going to have some younger players make a move for the receiving game to be productive this year. I think it will be a very interesting test case to see how much better Sam Hartman can make the receivers. Mm-hmm. And I know, talking to the staff here, they feel like he will, where last year you knew you were not getting the ball if you were running certain routes as a receiver. Right. And now sort of like everything's on, everything's open. He will take a chance and put it there. So that, in theory, should make that position better. But you're right. There's not anybody who's like, there's no there's no Marvin Harrison, there's no Jackson Smith and Jigba here. There hasn't been since, kind of Chase Claypool was very good. Will Fuller was great, but they don't have that next guy right now unless it proves to be Merriweather. But by game, Ohio State, I think, is the 5th game of the season for Notre Dame.
5th for Notre Dame, 4th for Ohio State.
We should know whether that's happening or not by then. But I can't sit here in July and say, like, Tobias Merriweather is going to be a stud. I think that he will be very good, but whether that happens this year, it's harder to say.
So on the other side of the ball, just like looking at what Notre Dame has coming back, like I fully understand any bit of optimism that's out there for them. But like I look at maybe the roster as a whole, and I think to myself that, like, if the defensive line like is not rocking, I just don't know if they can maybe reach the goals that even you're talking about here. Like, is that position the key to like the whole thing? Is that what determines the ceiling?
Yeah, that's going to be the limiting factor if Notre Dame doesn't make the playoff or doesn't make a run at the playoff. Like if they finish 9-3 instead of 10-2, like the defensive line is going to be the reason that they lost an extra game. I think Riley Mills on the interior, he's going into his senior year. Like he has a chance to have, like, he should be a next level pro. But there's no Isaiah Foskey. You lose the program's all-time sacks leader, and I'm not the guy that they're hoping to replace him. His name's Jordan Botello. He's a sort of a journeyman senior who's had every reason under the sun why he hasn't been productive so far. Those are guys that you don't really count on. So they may need kind of an out of nowhere story or two at that position. I think for the team as a whole to be a legit playoff contender. But you're right. Like that position, whereas in the past, I felt like, the receiver battle between Ohio State and Notre Dame was such a blowout for Ohio State. And it still is, but defensive line has suddenly become that too. It's like Ohio State is recruiting defensive linemen, Justin Scott included, at a level that Notre Dame is miles from right now. And they have some young guys who they feel good about, but this is very much a rebuilding year on the defensive line. And if it's hard to have a great team without a great defensive line. But that's what Notre Dame's going to have to try to do this year.
I guess what is the anticipation of how Javonte Jean-Baptiste fits into that after transferring over from Ohio State?
That's a good question, because I think that he will be a 40 snap player, 50 snap player. I don't know if he will start, but they rotate pretty liberally at that position. But he didn't play in the spring game. I don't know why. I think he dressed. And then there was an open practice that we got in the middle of spring practice. He didn't do anything in that either. So I'm not really sure where things stand with him. I mean, he looks like $1 million, but
it's always been the story here. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. I think that, Notre Dame fans are probably rereading some Ohio State stories and be like, oh yeah, maybe there's something to this, but it's, if you don't turn it on this year, this is it. Like, this is your last chance. So the fact that he didn't do anything in spring is a little bit of a concern. I don't think it's a huge red flag, but that could be one of the surprise stories that I'm talking about. But in the same way that they have this 4th-year defensive end named Jordan Botello, who's just like, is it discipline issues? Is it football IQ? Like, what's the problem? They need that story to come good, and they really need Jean-Baptiste to come good as well.
So as I'm going through this and just looking at some of the more interesting opponents on Ohio State's schedule, trying to figure out which of these teams have dudes that can actually make a difference, or like, as you mentioned earlier, guys that our Ohio State caliber is, as cocky as that sounds, but that's how we kind of couch it sometimes. But Notre Dame obviously is a program that has a lot of those guys every year. But one guy that interests me is the cornerback, Benjamin Morrison. He was on every freshman All-American list last year, had 6 picks last year. And maybe I'm a sicko who gets excited about a matchup 2 months before the game starts, but like him versus Marvin Harrison Jr. or him versus Emeka Ibuka, Is there any like sense of anticipation for that already in South Bend, and like what kind of marquee matchup that could be? Because I look at Morrison and I think like that's a kid who's going to be among the best corners in the country this year, and like maybe in a conversation for best corner in the country 2 years from now.
Yeah, there will be. I think this is sort of a difference in how Notre Dame views Ohio State this year to last year. I think that, not that Notre Dame would admit this, but I think there was sort of sheer terror about Ohio State's passing game last year. You wondered if Ohio State was just going to sort of pick a number for CJ Stroud, and that didn't really happen. So I think Notre Dame goes into this much more confident in their ability to play the pass than they were a year ago. But yeah, Ben Morrison, super smart, sharp corner. He's a 4-star prospect, but not, it wasn't like he was ranked 43rd overall. I mean, it was like, I think around 300. So his freshman season was a real eye opener. They played him against Ohio State. So, I mean, first game of his career, they throw him out there. And sort of he held his own. So that I have a lot of anticipation for that matchup. That's sort of one of the things like that. And, JTT or JT or whatever they call him there. Like if they line him up, whether it's Joe Alt or Blake Fisher, that's how Notre Dame, if they win, Blake Fisher and Joe Alt, who are both like Joe Alt's a top pick. Blake Fisher could be a first rounder. Like that's the matchup Notre Dame has to win most. But Ben Morrison against whoever is probably the matchup that is second. That's like I love college football games where you're watching two future pros go at it.
Yeah,
and I think we'll have a few matchups like that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this game for Ohio State, the Penn State game, and the Michigan game are the three that are going to present those kind of matchups. So I always get excited about those because some years there's only one of those games on Ohio State's schedule. So that there's three this year, I think is interesting. One last thing, excuse me, Pete. One last thing before we let you go, because you wrote about this recently, and I guess I had either forgotten or was unaware of the Georgia fan takeover of Notre Dame Stadium. When the Bulldogs went up to South Bend a couple years ago. What is the level of concern about a similar thing happening with Ohio State fans who are in much closer proximity to South Bend than Georgia fans were at that time?
Very high. If Ohio State beats Georgia in terms of the stadium takeover, I will be shocked, which says more about Georgia than it does about Ohio State. I do think that Notre Dame's administration and ticketing office came away from that experience sort of appalled at what had just happened. I'm trying to write about this for that week, and I talked to Jack Swarbrick, the AD, about it, and he's like, "Look, there's only so much we can do, but there are, those tickets never went to market. You could never just buy them, but the secondary market is the secondary market. And if Dame fans want to sell, then they'll sell." But yeah, there's some real concern about that. The red looks real bad if you're the home team in those situations. I mean, even the Cincinnati game from 2021 was pretty bad. That was more like probably a quarter of the stadium. But Georgia made it look like a bowl game, which was pretty brutal. I don't know what the Ohio State appetite is to get to Notre Dame Stadium. I would say it's probably pretty high. But I think for Georgia, I think Georgia fans were talking about the trip to Notre Dame for like 10 years. Whereas Notre Dame and Ohio State have played enough that it's not quite that special. And this is not the biggest game on Ohio State's schedule either. And you have other trips to Indiana, as you know. So if you miss Notre Dame, you can hit Bloomington or West Lafayette.
Yeah, you have to prioritize your Indiana travel if you're an Ohio State fan this year. I do wonder about how they'll view it, because obviously there's a game in Ann Arbor at the end of the year. Madison's pretty tough to get to. They play at Wisconsin, but that's not the easiest trip in the world, whether you want to fly or drive there. South Bend's pretty manageable. So I'm anticipating there are a lot of people who would want to go, but whether or not they can actually get the ticket in their hand, I guess is another question. But it seems like it doesn't feel like last year. The anticipation for last year, maybe because it was the opener,
Yeah.
It was different than it feels this year, but I still sense a lot of anticipation about this game. It is certainly among the most interesting and fascinating on Ohio State's schedule. We appreciate Pete Sampson from The Athletic for joining us to give us a little bit of a snapshot on the Fighting Irish a couple months away from that game up in South Bend. Thank you to Pete. We appreciate it. And thank you guys for listening. We'll talk to you next time.